Picture this: a drawing room in the middle of a winter afternoon, pale light coming through the tall windows, a fire going in the grate, and 40 of the finest families in the county seated in their best clothes, holding their cups of tea, watching the Marquess of Ashverton prepare to make the worst decision of his life. He had called it a gathering. That was the word his secretary had used in the invitations. A gathering, as though it were nothing more than an afternoon among friends. The silver was polished. The table was laid. The hothouse flowers had been arranged by someone with considerable skill and no small amount of expense. And Louisa Ashverton, the Marquess, had organized every last detail of it herself, as she had organized every last detail of every last social event in this house for 7 years, because that was what she did, and she was very, very good at it. She was standing near the window when it happened, not beside her husband. She had long since stopped standing beside her husband in the way that meant something. She was speaking with Lady Aldenwich, asking after her sister's new baby, genuinely curious, because Louisa was genuinely curious about people in a way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the fact that she had grown up understanding that most people were more interesting than they appeared if you asked the right question. And then Ashverton raised his glass. The room quieted the way rooms do when someone with authority clears their throat. Gradually, unwillingly, the conversations trailing off one at a time until there was only the fire and the sound of the wind against the glass. And 40 people looking at Ashverton with the polite attention of guests who have been invited to witness something and are not yet certain what it is. Louisa set down her teacup. He spoke of gratitude. He spoke of honesty, which she noted with a quiet and private clarity was rich, coming from him. He spoke of the heart finding what it finds, and the impossibility of continuing without acknowledging it. And then he turned to the woman who had been seated, not beside his wife, not across from his wife, but in the third chair on the left, the chair that Louisa had placed there herself, because a guest needed somewhere to sit, and he said her name, Miss Daphne Colworth. The woman who holds my heart. 40 people held 40 breaths. Louisa Ashverton stood very still beside the window. She had known, in the way you know things you have been carefully not examining, for perhaps a year. The late returns from London, the letters that arrived in an unfamiliar hand and disappeared before she could study them. The particular way Ashverton's attention had gone somewhere else even when he was in the room. She had noted it all in the careful, methodical way. She noted everything, and she had filed it away, and she had not opened the file, because the moment she opened it, she would have to act, and she had not yet been ready to act. She was ready now. She turned from the window. 40 faces turned to watch her. She understood what they wanted. A reaction, a spectacle, the confirmation that she had been diminished, that whatever Ashverton had just done had worked in the way he had intended it to work. She understood also that she had perhaps 10 seconds to determine what the rest of her life would look like. She walked across the room, not quickly, not slowly, at the pace of a woman who has been moving through difficult rooms her entire life and knows that the pace you keep is the message you send. She stopped in front of Miss Daphne Colworth. The woman was younger than Louisa, 24, perhaps 25, and beautiful in the deliberate high-contrast way of someone who understood exactly how she looked and dressed accordingly. She had expected Louisa could see it in her face, something dramatic, tears, words, a scene that would make the story better when it was told later. Louisa offered her hand. "Miss Colworth," she said, "how very glad I am that you've been comfortable in my home." She held the woman's gaze for one count of 3. Then she turned, collected her shawl from the back of her chair, and walked to the door. She did not look at Ashverton. Not once, not even at the threshold. She simply left. Behind her, the room exhaled, And then, because they were who they were and a story like this could not be contained, they began to talk. They would talk for months. They would talk about Ashverton's extraordinary lapse in judgment, about Miss Colworth's gown, about the silver on the table, and the hothouse flowers, and the terrible irony of Louisa herself, having arranged the room where she was publicly discarded. But what they would return to, what they would recount with the particular reverence that attaches to moments of genuine grace under impossible conditions, was Louisa. The handshake, the single sentence, the walk to the door. She didn't raise her voice, they would say. She didn't even change her expression. They were not wrong, but here is what no one in that room knew. Here is what Louisa herself barely understood yet, standing in the cold entrance hall with her shawl around her shoulders and the sound of 40 murmuring voices filtering through the closed drawing-room door. She had known this was coming for a year, and she had not spent that year waiting. The house in Keswick had belonged to her grandfather, not the grand estate that had been entailed to a distant male cousin when her uncle died without sons, a wound Louisa had stopped pressing on years ago because there was nothing useful in it. But the Keswick house, a solid stone-built place, overlooking the water, surrounded by 3 acres of farmland that her grandfather had cultivated with a seriousness that bordered on scientific, that had been left to her mother, and from her mother to her in terms so carefully specific that no subsequent marriage could touch it. She had not visited in 4 years. She had mentioned it to Ashverton once, in the early years, suggesting they might spend a summer there. He had said something dismissive about the North, and she had not raised it again. She had, however, been writing to the property manager, a steady and precise man named Mr. Halloran, every quarter for 7 years. She had sent instructions for repairs. She had approved the tenant arrangements. She had made quiet and considered decisions about drainage and roof maintenance and the kitchen garden. And she had done all of this without telling Ashverton, not out of deception, but because it had never seemed necessary to explain to him that she had something of her own. She had a letter from Mr. Halloran in her writing case at this very moment. She had read it 3 days ago and left it unanswered while she thought. She went upstairs. She packed 2 trunks. Her maid, a quiet and steady woman named Price, helped without asking a single question, which was one of the things Louisa valued most about her. By the time Ashverton's gathering had concluded and the last carriage had rolled down the drive, Louisa's trunks were loaded, and her own carriage was waiting. She told the driver to go north. She sat in the dark interior and watched the estate disappear behind her, the shape of it diminishing through the rear window, until there was nothing left but the evening sky and the road ahead. Her hands were folded in her lap. They were perfectly still. The shaking, if it came, would come later. It had not come yet. What she felt instead was the strange and vertiginous sensation of a thing long braced for having finally arrived. The odd relief of it, the way the anticipation dissolves the moment the thing actually happens, and you discover you have survived the moment you were most afraid of. She had survived it. The house in Keswick smelled of cold stone and the particular stillness of a place that has been waiting rather than abandoned. Mr. Halloran had seen to it that there were fires lit and food in the kitchen, and the basic decency of a house prepared for habitation. He was a man of 60-something, with the manner of someone who had spent a long career forming accurate assessments of situations and keeping those assessments quietly to himself until they were useful. He opened the door before the carriage had fully stopped. He looked at the trunks. He looked at Louisa. He said nothing except, "The south bedroom has the better view this time of year." "Thank you, Mr. Halloran," Louisa said. "That will do very nicely." She went inside. She stood in the entrance for a long moment, the cold still in her coat, the journey still in her bones. The house was smaller than Ashverton Hall. Lower ceilings, plainer walls, windows that looked out over the lake and the fells rather than a manicured park designed to impress visitors. But it was real in a way she had forgotten things could be real. Solid. Its own thing entirely. Nothing in it was performing. She sat down at the desk in the parlor and wrote a letter to her solicitor. Not Ashverton's solicitor, who had handled their joint affairs for 7 years, but her own, a man named Mr. Peregrine Fitch, whom she had retained independently at the age of 22, because her grandmother had once told her that every woman of sense ought to have her own solicitor and her own opinions, and keep both to herself until they were needed. Her grandmother had been right about most things. She asked Mr. Fitch a single question. She sealed the letter. She sent it. Then she went to bed for the first time in longer than she could calculate and slept without dreaming. The reply from Mr. Fitch arrived in 4 days. It was, as everything from Mr. Fitch was, thorough, precise, and considerably more useful than she had hoped. The Keswick property was hers absolutely, held in terms that predated her marriage and could not be touched by it. Her mother's investments, transferred to Louisa on her 25th birthday, were intact and had been quietly growing for a decade under Mr. Fitch's management, because Louisa had never found occasion to spend them. At Ashverton Hall she had wanted for nothing material, and she had long ago stopped wanting for the things that money could not supply. The sum was not vast. It was not the fortune of a great house, but it was independence, clean and real and entirely hers, and she read the number twice and then sat looking out at the lake for a very long time. She was not ruined. She had half feared it. In the sleepless hours since the gathering, when the adrenaline had faded and the things she had survived began to settle into something that required actual reckoning, she had lain awake working through the arithmetic of her situation and finding it uncomfortably uncertain. Now, with Mr. Fitch's letter in her hands, the uncertainty clarified. She was not ruined. She was, in fact, in a position she had not occupied since before her marriage. She was free to decide. She picked up her pen and wrote a second letter, this one to her old friend from school, a woman named Bethany Merrow, who had the particular combination of genuine warmth and complete discretion that made her invaluable in the kind of situation Louisa now found herself occupying. She did not explain everything. She simply said she was in Keswick and would very much appreciate a visit when Bethany could manage it. Bethany arrived on Thursday, driving herself in a gig because, as she announced upon arrival, she had sent the coachman to his sister's wedding and refused to delay her own journey on his account. "You look extraordinary," she said, standing in the doorway of the parlor and taking in Louisa with the frank assessment of an old friend. "I mean that in the specific sense that you look entirely different from how you looked the last time I saw you, and the difference is not one I would have predicted." "Sit down," Louisa said. "Price will bring tea." Bethany sat. "They are saying," she said, accepting the chair nearest the fire, "that Ashverton has entirely lost his mind. They are saying it quite uniformly, which is unusual. The consensus generally includes Miss Colworth's wardrobe as an aggravating circumstance. What are they saying about me?" Bethany looked at her steadily. "That you are either the most composed woman in England or the most devastated, and that no one can tell which, and that the handshake was either the act of a saint or the most quietly terrifying thing they have ever witnessed in a drawing room. There is genuine debate. Which do you think?" "I think," Bethany said, "that you are doing something. I don't know yet what it is. But you have the look of a woman who has already decided." Louisa looked at the lake through the window. The afternoon light was on it, gray and silver, and very clear. "I have a great deal of correspondence to catch up on," she said. Bethany, who was perceptive enough to understand what this meant and wise enough not to press further, drank her tea and talked about her children and her roses and the particular disgrace of the road between here and Penrith, and she came back the following Tuesday, and the one after that, and she was not the only one. They came, the women of the county, and then the women from further away, drawn first by curiosity, and then by something harder to name, a quality in what was happening at the Keswick house that seemed to pull at people the way genuinely true things pull at people. Lady Aldenwich came and stayed for lunch and left looking thoughtful. Young Harriet Vane. No, the family was Vane, wasn't it? No, that name was on the list. Louisa set that aside. A young woman from the village, recently married to a man twice her age and already quietly bewildered by what she'd agreed to, appeared at the kitchen door one morning and was taken in and given tea and something more practical, which was the address of Mr. Peregrine Fitch. Mr. Fitch himself came twice in person. He sat at Louisa's dining table and spread papers across it and explained, in his unhurried and particular way, exactly what she was entitled to, exactly what Ashverton could and could not do, and exactly what the legal architecture of a formal separation would look like and require. It was during the second of these meetings that she learned about the debts. She had not known. She had managed the household accounts at Ashverton Hall with considerable precision. She knew to the pound what the house cost to run, what the staff cost, what the estate required in a good year and a difficult one. But she had not known, because she had not been given access to know, what lay underneath. The Ashverton estate had been leveraged quietly and systematically over the better part of a decade. Not ruinously, not yet, but the margins were narrower than the surface suggested, and the interest accumulating was beginning to make itself felt in ways that could not be much longer deferred. Miss Colworth, Mr. Fitch noted delicately, had a prior connection to a gentleman in Cheshire, whose circumstances had improved considerably before she entered his life and declined considerably afterward. He had been thorough. Louisa sat with this information for a long time. She felt, not triumph exactly, but something colder and more useful than triumph, clarity, a complete picture where before there had been only the parts she'd been permitted to see. She asked Mr. Fitch to bring her everything. He reached into his case and produced a folder that was considerably thicker than she had expected and placed it on the table between them and said, "I was rather hoping you would say that." It was on a gray Thursday, 3 weeks after Louisa had arrived in Keswick, that she encountered the man from the neighboring property. She had gone out to look at the kitchen garden, which Mr. Halloran had reported needed attention, and which Louisa had begun to suspect was an understatement of considerable proportions. She was standing at the far edge of the property, examining the state of the drainage along the wall, when she became aware of someone on the other side of the fence. A man, perhaps 35, with the kind of permanent tan that comes from working outdoors in a serious rather than leisurely way. He had a sheepdog at his heel and a coil of rope over one shoulder, and he was looking at the drainage situation with an expression that mirrored hers. "It's been doing this for 2 winters," he said, as though they had already been in conversation. "The slope is wrong. Whoever built this wall set it to drain toward the garden rather than away. Can it be corrected?" he considered. "Not cheaply, but not impossibly." He looked at her. "You're Lady Ashverton." "I am," she said. "And you are?" "Rowan," he said. "Callum Rowan. My family's held the East Field for 30 years. A pause. "I'm sorry about what happened, for what it's worth." It was the first time anyone had said this to her directly and without theater, and it was, she found, worth quite a lot. "The drainage," she said. "What would it require?" he told her. He spoke about it practically, the way someone speaks about something they know well and have thought about seriously, with no performance in it. He told her what the options were, and what each would cost, and what each would produce, and then he stopped and let her think. She found this after 7 years of a husband who told her what the conclusion was and expected her to agree, profoundly restoring. They stood at the fence for 20 minutes discussing drainage and the state of the kitchen garden wall, and the particular difficulty of the soil on the Keswick property's south side. When he left, touching the brim of his cap, with the unself-conscious courtesy of a man who had been brought up to be decent rather than to appear decent, Louisa stood for a moment at the fence and thought that she could not remember the last time a conversation had left her, feeling entirely like herself rather than slightly less than herself. She went inside. On the desk, Mr. Fitch's papers waited, and in the south a letter was being composed. Ashverton had waited 3 weeks. This was, Louisa had not known, but would have predicted, the maximum he could manage. He arrived without sending word ahead, which she recognized as intentional. He had expected to find her in disarray, dependent, grateful for the interruption. He had not expected to find her in the garden with her coat sleeves pushed up, in conference with Mr. Halloran about the condition of the apple trees, and apparently unbothered. She saw his carriage come through the gate. She finished her conversation. She pulled her sleeves down and walked to meet him with the measured pace of a woman who is not hurrying because she has nothing to hurry for. "Louisa," he said, and then stopped. She could see him recalibrating. She did not look the way he had expected. "Ashverton," she said pleasantly, "come inside. Mr. Halloran will find us something warm to drink." He sat in the parlor and looked at the room with the expression of a man in a space that did not organize itself around him, and did not quite know how to manage the experience. He was handsome, still. He had always been handsome. She noted it the way she noted facts, accurately, without feeling. "This is unnecessary," he said, the opening of a man who had rehearsed an argument and committed to authority as his main approach. "You've made your point. Come home." "I am home," Louisa said. "Ashverton Hall belongs to you," she agreed. "In the same way this house belongs to me, so yes, I am home." He looked at her. Something shifted in the confident architecture of his expression. "The situation with Daphne," he said, and then didn't continue, "is resolving itself, I would imagine," Louisa said. "Or not. I haven't the faintest interest either way." This was true. She had discovered in the past 3 weeks, genuinely without interest in Miss Colworth as a subject. The woman had happened to her life the way a winter storm happens, consequentially, and then it was done, and what mattered was the landscape it left behind. "You can't simply. You're my wife." "I am," she said. "I've been your wife for 7 years while you were conducting yourself in ways that had nothing to do with that fact. So the fact of it doesn't seem, on its own, sufficient. What would be different, Ashverton? I'd like you to actually answer that." He opened his mouth. He closed it. She had known he wouldn't have an answer. He had not married her, for reasons that required him to think carefully about what she needed. He had married her because she was suitable and capable, and came with a good name and an attractive address, and because she had been, in those early years, willing to believe he was more than the surface of him. That willingness she had spent. She had spent it gradually, in small amounts, over many years, until one afternoon, in a drawing room, she had run out of it entirely. He left 40 minutes later without having achieved what he'd come for. Louisa watched his carriage go from the window of the parlor. Then she turned back to the papers on the desk. She had not told him about Mr. Fitch's findings. She had not told him what she knew. She was not ready to use it yet. Not as leverage. That was not what it was for. It was simply knowledge, and knowledge organized correctly was the difference between a woman who was acted upon and a woman who could act. She was very nearly ready to act. The unraveling in society began in November, as these things always did, not with a single decisive moment, but with accumulation, the ton being a machine that ran on accumulation and required only the first small crack to begin its work. The first crack appeared at a dinner in Carlisle, where someone thought to mention Miss Colworth in the same sentence as a gentleman in Cheshire, whose fortunes had taken a significant turn some years prior. At precisely the time, a certain young woman of remarkable appearance had been in the neighborhood. The connection was not stated explicitly. It did not need to be. By morning it was in 3 separate letters, and by the following week it had bred into something considerably more substantial. Ashverton heard it. He went to Daphne Colworth with what he'd heard, and she was charming and plausible and entirely reassuring, and for 4 days he believed her. Then the letter arrived from his primary creditor. It was brief and it was civil, and it made clear in the way that only very serious letters managed to make clear that the time for civility was approaching its natural limits. He went back to Daphne. He told her about the letter. She listened, and she took his hand and said, with all the warmth she's capable of, which was considerable, that surely, between the two of them, they could find a solution. And had he ever thought about introducing her to Lord Wethersfield, who was so wealthy, who had recently been widowed, who would surely welcome the opportunity to invest in the right sort of venture? Ashverton looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Louisa in the parlor in Keswick, asking him in a clear and ordinary voice what would be different, as though the answer were a real thing she was genuinely interested in receiving. He thought about the way she had not raised her voice once, in the drawing room or at the Keswick house, not once in 7 years in his recollection. He thought about what that cost, the sustained and absolute control of it, and how he had interpreted it all this time as temperament rather than what it actually was, which was discipline. He thought about Louisa saying, "I haven't the faintest interest either way." He had believed her. That was the thing that had settled in him like a stone. She had not said it to wound him. She had said it because it was true. He said goodbye to Miss Colworth on a Thursday. She left for Edinburgh with the composed practicality of a woman who knew when a chapter was concluded and began new chapters efficiently. He did not, in the aftermath, feel what he expected to feel. He sat in the study at Ashverton Hall for a long time, looking at the creditor's letter, and then he took out a piece of paper, and he wrote for quite a while. The letter arrived in Keswick on a Saturday morning. Louisa was at the desk. She recognized the handwriting immediately and set aside what she was reading. It was 3 pages, which surprised her. Ashverton was not, in the ordinary way, a man of 3 pages. He was a man of 1 paragraph, 2 at most, in which the main point arrived early and was not revisited. This was different. He did not apologize performatively, which she had half expected and would have discarded. What he did instead was describe. He described, with a specificity that suggested he had been sitting with it for some time before putting it to paper, the particular series of choices he had made. Not as justification, not as explanation, but as accounting. Here is what I did. Here is what I knew when I did it. Here is where I looked away on purpose and called it something other than what it was. He said he was sorry. He said he understood that it was inadequate. He said it anyway, because she was owed it, even if it changed nothing. And then, at the end of the 3rd page, in handwriting that had gone slightly less controlled than the beginning, as though the pressure of the pen had increased without his noticing, "I have been trying to think about what I actually understood about you in 7 years, and the answer I keep arriving at is less than I thought at the time, and considerably less than you deserved. You were standing right in front of me. I think I knew this and made a decision not to fully look." Louisa set the letter down. She sat for some time. Outside, the lake was pale and still under a low winter sky. The house was quiet. Price was somewhere upstairs. Mr. Halloran was doing something useful with the fence along the east field. She had not expected to feel grief. She had anticipated the letter, had known, with the accuracy of someone who had spent 7 years reading a person's behavior, that it was coming. She had expected relief, perhaps, or the clean resolution of something finally named. What she felt instead was grief. Not for Ashverton as he was. For the 19-year-old girl who had married him with genuine hope, in a dress her mother had cried over, believing she was beginning something that would be worth the believing. She allowed herself the grief for 20 minutes. It was real, and it deserved its time. Then she opened the desk drawer and placed the letter inside, and she picked up her pen. The document from Mr. Fitch arrived on a Monday. It was, as his letters always were, precise and without excess. The attached, it said in his two-sentence way, represents the terms I would recommend in the circumstances. I have taken the liberty of making them thorough. It was a formal separation agreement, not a divorce. Such things were not easily achieved, not for a Marquess, not without an act of Parliament and a scandal of a scale that served no one. But the agreement was designed with care. Separate maintenance, separate residence, which was already a fact, control over her own property and finances, full and unambiguous. No requirement of public association beyond the minimum the law demanded. Freedom in every sense that practically mattered. She sat with it at the desk for a long time. Outside she could hear Callum Rowan working at the east fence, which he had offered to assess and had apparently decided required immediate attention, and whose presence on the property had become, she had noticed, a regular occurrence that she had said nothing about because she found it neither unwelcome nor in need of comment. She put the document aside. She put on her coat and walked out to the east fence. "I have something to think through," she said to the fence line. "I find I think better out loud. I won't require responses unless you have something useful to add." Callum Rowan lowered his tools and turned to look at her with the straightforward attentiveness that was simply his manner she'd learned, not politeness, not performance, but genuine listening. She talked for 40 minutes, not about the specifics of the document. Those were not his to carry, but about the shape of the decision, about what it meant to close something formally rather than simply live around the edges of it, about independence as something chosen rather than fallen into, about what she was building here and whether it was real or whether it only seemed real because everything before it had been so comprehensively false. He listened to all of it. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The drainage on the south wall. You said you'd decided on the permanent fix rather than the patch. You said the patch was cheaper, but the permanent fix was what the problem actually required." She looked at him. "I thought that was a sensible way to think about it," he said, and went back to the fence. She went inside and signed the document. She sent it to Mr. Fitch with a brief note. Then she stood up and went to the kitchen and asked the cook, a broad, efficient woman named Mrs. Tarwick, who had been at the house for 15 years and ran the kitchen with the precision of someone who took the work seriously, whether there was any chance of biscuits with the afternoon tea. Mrs. Tarwick said there was always biscuits and looked at Louisa in the way she had been looking at her since the first week, with the expression of someone watching a plant they were not certain would survive discover that it would. Louisa went back to her desk. She had quite a lot to do. The invitation from Lady Aldenwich arrived the following week, worded in the careful way of someone who understood that the occasion it proposed was itself a statement. It was not a gathering. That word was ruined now, at least in its formal sense. It was a dinner. 12 people, good people, the kind of people who had watched Ashverton's drawing room performance with the expressions of those who were deciding something about a man they had previously thought they knew. The invitation was addressed to Lady Ashverton. Not the Marquess and Marchioness, not the household of Ashverton, to Louisa, in her own name, in her own right. She wrote her acceptance the same morning. Bethany came the day before. She sat across from Louisa in the parlor with a cup of tea and the look of a woman taking careful stock of something she had watched develop from the beginning. "How do you feel?" she asked, which was the real question rather than the decorative one. Louisa considered it properly. Not the reflexive perfectly well thank you of 7 years of required composure, but the actual answer arrived at by actually looking. "Ready," she said. "Not for them, for myself. There's a difference." "There is," Bethany said. "I'm not sure most people understand it." The dinner was easy in the way that things become easy once you've stopped carrying weight that wasn't yours to carry. Louisa moved through the room and was simply present in it. Not managing it, not performing it, not calculating 3 moves ahead. She spoke to people because she was interested in them. She laughed when something was funny. She held opinions and stated them, calmly, and without the habitual softening she had developed over years of managing a husband who did not like to be contradicted. Lady Aldenwich leaned over at the end of the evening and said quietly, "I've known you for 6 years. I don't believe I've met you before tonight." "No," Louisa said. "I don't think you have." On the way home in the carriage, with the fells dark against a sky full of stars, she sat very still and let herself feel it. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but the particular and complete sensation of a life that had been lived at a slight angle to itself, finally settling into its proper alignment. The work expanded the way good work tends to expand when it has room. The kitchen garden was rehabilitated over the course of a winter, which turned out to be a project of considerably greater scope than Louisa had initially understood, and which she found herself unexpectedly engrossed in. Not the labor itself. She was realistic about what she knew and what she didn't. But the organizing of it, the decisions, the understanding of what the land actually required versus what it had been forced to produce through neglect and wishful thinking. She and Mr. Halloran spent 3 mornings a week walking the property, and she asked questions he answered without condescension, and she made notes, and the decisions she made turned out to be better decisions when she'd had time to think about them. She opened a small lending library in the village. This began as an accident. She had too many books and too little room for them, and she mentioned this to Mrs. Tarwick, who mentioned it to someone, who arrived at the kitchen door a week later, asking if they might borrow something. By February there were 12 people with standing arrangements, and by March there were 20. And by spring it had become a thing that existed, rather than a thing she had decided to create, which seemed to her the best way for things to come into being. Mr. Fitch reported that the separation agreement had been received and signed by Ashverton without contest or alteration. He also reported, in the delicate way of a man sharing something he had gathered at the margins of his professional knowledge, that Ashverton had engaged a new firm, dismissed certain members of his London household, and had been observed, by a source Mr. Fitch did not name, doing something with the estate accounts that suggested genuine rather than performative attention. She thought about this. She thought about the letter in the desk drawer, the one she had not answered, the one she had kept because it was honest, and because honesty deserved to be kept even when it came too late. She wrote back to Ashverton in April. It was brief. She told him she wished him well and that she hoped the drainage scheme on the East Field would prove instructive, since Callum Rowan had recommended a similar approach to her own south wall, and it had been entirely correct. Ashverton wrote back. It was also brief, and it was, she found to her surprise, funny in a dry and self-deprecating way she had not previously associated with him, as though the version of himself he had been for most of their marriage had simply been in the way of a quality he'd always possessed. She hoped, without any complication, that he would find it useful. Spring arrived, and with it the apple trees. Callum had told her in January that the trees along the east wall were in better condition than they appeared, that the neglect of 4 years was surface neglect, and that the root systems were sound if the growing season was managed correctly. She had taken this on faith and discovered in April that he had been exactly right. They bloomed in a long, cold rush of white that arrived on a Thursday, and lasted 2 weeks, and made her stand in the middle of the garden on a quiet morning, looking at it, feeling something she hadn't had a name for at the time, but recognized later as happiness. The real kind, the kind that doesn't require an audience. One of the trees at the far corner, the one that had looked most compromised, the one she had asked about directly and been told was uncertain, wait and see, produced the most blossom of all of them. Louisa stood under it for a long time. Mrs. Tarwick made 12 jars of preserves from that tree in the autumn, and was enormously proud of this, and rightly so. Bethany came in July and sat in the garden and ate a great deal, and complained happily about the journey, and brought news, as she always brought news. Miss Colworth was in Edinburgh, then London, then Paris, then Edinburgh again. She had, by all accounts, landed somewhere comfortable, as people of her particular gifts tended to land somewhere comfortable, and the wife of the man in whose orbit she had currently settled was reportedly beginning to pay attention. Louisa listened to this and felt the mild and general concern she would have felt for anyone in that position, and then moved on. Ashverton was better. This was Bethany's word, and Louisa turned it over and found it accurate, not transformed. She was a precise thinker, and transformation was too large a claim for what she observed. Better, which was smaller and harder and more durable. He sold the lodge in Galloway, Bethany said. He's reduced the London staff. He's been seen at his own estate for 3 consecutive months, which I believe is unprecedented. He'll be all right, Louisa said. She meant it plainly. He was not a malicious man. He had been a careless one, a man so accustomed to the world organizing itself around him that he had never developed the capacity to organize himself around anyone else, and that capacity, she had learned, could be built if the will was there. Whether his will was there was no longer her concern. She found this fact neither sad nor satisfying. It was simply true. And you, Bethany said in the tone that meant she was asking the real thing. Louisa thought about it honestly. I have a house, she said, that smells of stone and good wood and the particular kind of cold that comes off a lake in the morning, which I have decided I love. I have Mr. Halloran, who is the most useful man I have ever encountered. I have Mrs. Tarwick, whose ginger biscuits I am fairly certain are the finest thing produced in this county. I have a lending library with 23 members and a waiting list. She paused. I have you. Bethany waited, with the patience of someone who knows there is a further thing. And I have Callum Rowan, Louisa said, who tells me the truth about apple trees and drainage, and everything else he knows about, which is considerable, and who has never once told me what to think. Bethany's expression settled into something quiet and satisfied. You're happy, she said, not a question. I'm something more accurate than happy, Louisa said. I'm myself. I've learned they're not identical. It was a Thursday morning in October when Callum Rowan appeared at the garden gate with his hat in his hands and an expression Louisa had not seen on him before. He was not a man who showed uncertainty. He was someone who felt it, she suspected, but had learned to wait until he was sure before acting. The expression suggested he was sure. She was at the end of the apple rows, looking at the trees. The fruit had been taken in, the branches were bare, and there was something in the bare trees that she found, still, more interesting than she could entirely account for. The patient quality of them, the visible structure of what they were under the softening of leaves and blossom. Lady Ashverton, he said. Louisa, she said. They had arrived at first names some weeks ago, without either of them having proposed it. It had simply become accurate. Louisa, he said. He looked at the trees, he looked at her. He had the quality she valued most in a person, which was that he considered what he was going to say before he said it, and then said it plainly. I would like to ask you something, he said, and I want to be direct about what I'm asking so that there's no confusion. I appreciate that, she said. I have been your neighbor for 9 months, he said, and your friend for most of them, and I find that I would like to be more than your friend, with your full knowledge of my circumstances and no expectations about the pace of anything. I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm asking whether I may ask." Louisa looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 19 and the dress her mother had cried over, and the genuine conviction then that she was walking towards something permanent and good. She thought about what permanent and good actually required. Not the ceremony, or the title, or the suitable match, but the daily and undramatic work of two people choosing to be honest with each other in small things and large ones, without performance, without an audience, just the sustained and ordinary decision to look directly at the person in front of you and tell the truth. She had learned the difference between a man who looked at her and saw the surface of her, and a man who was paying attention. "You may ask," she said. He asked. She said yes. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the village church, with Mr. Halloran and Mrs. Tarwick and Bethany, and 23 members of the lending library, who had taken a collective decision to attend, and the 24th member who heard about it afterward and was very put out that she'd missed it. Ashverton sent a letter that arrived the morning of the wedding. It was brief, and it was. She read it twice to be sure. Genuine. He wished her well. He said he hoped she had found the life she ought to have had from the beginning. He said, in the final line, in writing that had gone slightly uneven the way it did when he was not watching the pen, "I believe you will be magnificent at it. You were magnificent at everything else." She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of the desk, not in the back of the drawer, on top where she could find it. It was evidence of something she believed about people, that they were capable, sometimes, of growing into the understanding of what they should have known earlier, and that this, even when it came too late to change anything important, was not nothing. It was, in fact, something. She had taught herself to receive it as such. 2 years and 1 winter after the afternoon, she had walked out of a drawing room in front of 40 witnesses, with her hands steady and her voice entirely controlled. Louisa Rowan sat at the desk in the study at the Keswick house and looked out at the orchard. The trees were bare again, patient, beginning at the very tips of the easternmost branches, to show the first faint swelling of what would come in spring. She knew to look for it now. She had learned. Mr. Halloran was somewhere on the property doing something useful. The lending library had expanded to accommodate a second room, which had been Callum's suggestion, and which she had agreed to after 20 minutes of thinking it through. Bethany was coming next week. Mrs. Tarwick had been experimenting with a new recipe for the ginger biscuits, and the experiments were going extremely well. On the corner of the desk, visible without opening anything, was a letter she had received the previous month from a young woman in the village. Not a woman she knew. Someone who had heard, through the particular and efficient channels by which information moves in small communities, something about what had happened 2 years ago and something about what had come after. The letter asked, with the straightforward plainness of someone who has not yet learned to ask for things indirectly, how she had done it. How she had walked out of a room in the middle of everything and made something else. Louisa had read it several times. She had written back this: "I did not walk out to win anything. I walked out because staying would have required me to continue building my life inside of someone else's story. And I had finally understood that I was allowed to have my own. The rest, the house, the library, the apple trees, the man who tells me the truth about things, that came from the walking out, not from the room I was in. I cannot tell you it was simple. It required Mr. Halloran and Mrs. Tarwick and a great deal of correspondence and one very good solicitor, and the sustained conviction that what I was building was real even when I couldn't yet see the whole of it. But the first step was knowing I was allowed to take it. I wish someone had told me sooner. I am telling you now." She picked up her pen. There was work to do, and she was very good at it. And the morning was clear, and the orchard was waiting, and outside the lake was cold and still and entirely itself.